A police officer thought his grandfather had left him nothing but a crumbling 10-story building. Just a worthless inheritance worth barely $1. But the moment he pushed open the rusted doors, he froze, because standing inside the shadows was a German shepherd, staring at him as if it had been waiting all these years. And when the dog led him deeper into the dust-covered halls, he uncovered a secret vault holding $100 million money his grandfather had hidden away from greedy, ungrateful heirs. Why was the dog guarding this place? And why had his grandfather chosen only him, the grandson he barely knew, to carry the legacy forward? What happened next will make you cry and believe in miracles again. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you believe that every animal deserves a loving home, not loneliness, hit that subscribe button, because what you're about to hear might just change how you see the world. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town where silence had a sound. That afternoon, the rain didn't fall. It whispered. Cold mist clung to the bare limbs of sycamore trees and turned the streets to a dull mirror of gray sky. Autumn had nearly burned itself out. Leaves, damp and forgotten, plastered the sidewalks, and a soft wind curled through the alleys like a tired sigh. This was the kind of day people stayed inside, sipping old coffee and watching windows fog. Jake Harrison, badge number 6723, stepped from his patrol car and stood still in the hush. The soles of his boots met the wet pavement with the steadiness of someone trained to walk toward chaos. Today, however, wasn't about arrests or dispatch calls. Today was about goodbyes and unexpected beginnings. Jake was 29, tall and broad-shouldered, with the quiet discipline of a man shaped by both lineage and loss. His dark blue uniform clung to him with the weight of rain and memory. His hair was short, his jaw sharp, and his eyes, cold steel blue, seemed to carry the burden of someone who had seen too much too young. People in town often said he looked like Elias Harrison, his grandfather, if you stripped away 30 years and half the fire. And Elias had been fire. A former police chief, Elias Harrison ruled the town decades ago with iron morals and a granite stare. He was not a man who gave affection easily, but he gave protection, justice. His sons called him severe. Jake had called him Sir, not out of fear, but respect. Now he was gone, and Jake was walking into his shadow. The door to Pierce & Ward Law creaked as Jake stepped into the warmth. The room smelled of lemon oil and old paper. Heavy books lined the walls like sleeping soldiers. Inside the main conference room, the family was already gathered. Richard Harrison, Elias's eldest son, stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes scanning the rain like it owed him something. A retired contractor, Richard had always worn his pride like armor, and today it showed in the stiff line of his back. Beside him, Clara, Elias's only daughter, sat with a silk scarf looped around her pale neck, her fingers wrapped around a porcelain teacup she hadn't sipped from. Her makeup was flawless, her smile brittle. Years of country club dinners and rehearsed grief had shaped her into a woman who grieved politely. At the end of the table lounged Raymond Clara's son, an overconfident man in his mid-30s with slicked-back hair and a watch that glinted every time he moved his hand for attention. His cologne arrived before he did. Jake greeted them with a nod, but no one returned it. At the head of the table sat Graham Pierce, the family's attorney for over 3 decades. In his 60s, with silver hair and an air of practiced patience, Graham wore his professionalism like a second skin. He motioned for Jake to take a seat. "We're here to settle the estate of the late Elias Harrison," Graham began, flipping open a folder as solemnly as a priest opening scripture. Jake listened in silence as the lawyer read the will. "To my son, Richard," Graham said, "I leave the northern farmland and the equipment stored therein." Richard exhaled quietly. Not surprise. Expectation. "To my daughter Clara, I leave the Elm Street house and all assets attached." Clara tilted her head in practiced gratitude. "Thank you, Daddy," she whispered to no one. Jake leaned forward slightly. His name hadn't been spoken yet. His hands rested on his knees, steady, trained, prepared. "And to my grandson, Jacob Elias Harrison," Graham continued, "I leave the Harrison building located at 901 Jefferson Avenue 10 stories high, currently abandoned." A pause. Then laughter. Raymond burst first, slapping the table with one palm. "The Pigeon Palace?" he said. "Grandpa left you a pile of bricks and bird crap, man." Clara chuckled behind her hand. Even Richard allowed himself a smirk. Jake didn't respond. Years on the force had taught him not to flinch, but deep inside, a spark of something burned disappointment maybe. Or worse, confirmation. Graham cleared his throat. "All other assets have been distributed as per the will. The Harrison building is the sole property of Mr. Jacob Harrison as of today." As the family filtered out, murmuring and chuckling, Graham slid an envelope across the table toward Jake. It was thick, cream-colored, and sealed with old-fashioned wax, scrawled in Elias's firm, slanted hand. For Jake. Jake didn't open it. Not yet. "Your grandfather believed in puzzles," Graham said gently. "He never left anything meaningless." Jake nodded once and left without a word. By the time he reached Jefferson Avenue, dusk had swallowed Cedar Hollow. Streetlights blinked to life one by one, casting gold halos through the mist. Jake parked across the street from the building that bore his family name like a monument no one visited anymore. The Harrison building had once been the pride of the city, a stone and steel high-rise from the post-war boom, back when Cedar Hollow still dreamed of being more than a footnote on the map. Now, the windows were dark, some broken, and ivy crept along the base like time trying to erase it. Jake crossed the street slowly. The air smelled of damp concrete and rust. Rain whispered against his shoulders. As he reached the rusted iron gates, he paused. And that's when he saw it. From the shadows beneath the arch, a shape moved, silent, deliberate. A dog stepped forward from the gloom. Not just any dog, a German shepherd. It was large but aged, with a thick sable coat tinged in silver. Its back legs moved stiffly, signs of time and long service. Across its snout, a streak of gray fur softened the once bold markings. Scars laced one foreleg like lightning caught in fur. One ear stood upright, the other slightly bent at the tip, as if marked by life itself. But it was the dog's eyes that stopped Jake in his tracks. They were amber-deep, intelligent, and strangely knowing. Eyes that had seen too much and forgotten too little. They didn't just look at Jake, they looked into him. The dog didn't growl, didn't bark. It simply stood, tail low and still, head tilted slightly, as if it had been waiting. Jake swallowed. He had seen enough working dogs to know this wasn't a stray. This dog had purpose, training, loyalty, maybe even a mission. The shepherd took 2 steps back, retreating into the building's shadow. Then it stopped, turned, and stared again, an invitation, or maybe a challenge. But Jake didn't follow. He stood there, raindrops dripping from his jawline, heart hammering harder than it had since his first shootout. Something about the building, about that dog felt sacred, heavy with meaning. Whatever waited inside would not be walked into casually. So Jake stayed where he was, beneath the flickering street lamp, boots planted on wet ground, eyes locked with the guardian in the doorway. Not yet. The rain had lessened into a whisper, a soft rhythm against the windows of the long-abandoned Harrison building. Jake stood in the drizzle, hands in his pockets, his eyes still locked on the creature guarding the doorway. The German shepherd hadn't moved. Not an inch. Its stillness was eerie, deliberate, as if it were carved from the shadows themselves. Jake took a slow step forward. The dog didn't retreat. Another step. Still nothing. He sighed. "Look, buddy," Jake muttered. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but this place isn't your home anymore." The shepherd tilted its head, then it made a slow circle in place, sniffed the ground, padded toward the door, and turned to glance at Jake again, persistent. Jake frowned and took another cautious step. "You deaf? Or just stubborn?" he muttered. No response, just the steady gaze. Jake finally crossed the threshold. The scent of mildew and dust hit him like a wall. He coughed once, pulled his collar over his mouth, and took in the place. Shattered glass littered the floor. Rusted filing cabinets lay on their sides like fallen soldiers. The air inside felt different charged, somehow. And the dog? Still watching him. Jake waved his arm. "Go on, shoo, go back where you came from." The shepherd didn't budge. It walked past him instead, claws clicking against cracked tile. It moved slowly, but with purpose. Nose low, body alert. Jake followed, curiosity overtaking caution. The dog made a sharp turn near the old elevator shaft where the walls were tagged with graffiti and the ceiling sagged dangerously. Without warning, the dog halted and let out a low, rumbling growl. Jake froze. A tile overhead creaked. He looked up just in time to see part of the plaster buckle. He stepped back instinctively as a section of the ceiling crashed to the floor where he'd been standing. His breath caught. His heart pounded. He turned to look at the dog. The shepherd stood calm now, watching him again. Jake exhaled. "All right, that's not nothing." He took a knee and examined the dog more carefully. Its age was clearer now, maybe 10, maybe 12 years. Thick neck, strong legs, though a slight tremble ran through its hindquarters when it paused too long. On its collar, tarnished and loose, was a name tag. He brushed the dust aside with a gloved finger. Shadow. He read the name out loud. "Shadow, huh?" The shepherd blinked slowly. Jake gave a half laugh. "Of course. You look like a shadow. A big, hairy, stubborn one." He stood. "Well, Shadow, I don't know who left you here or why you're still sticking around, but I'm going in. You're not my responsibility." Shadow made a sound like a chuff, then patted on ahead, slipping into the darkness like he'd heard that line before. Jake followed more slowly this time. His flashlight flickered as he moved deeper into the lobby. Water dripped from cracked pipes above, echoing in the silence. Dust particles floated like ghosts through the beam of his light, and then a memory. He hadn't expected it, hadn't invited it, but it came anyway, flooding in with the smell of wet concrete and old dog. He was 6 years old again, sitting cross-legged in the living room of his grandfather's house. Elias stood in the doorway, still in his uniform, while a canine named Rex curled at Jake's feet. "Always trust a dog," Elias had told him, voice rough with age. "They don't waste time with lies." Jake remembered the way Rex had leaned into him, heavy and warm. He remembered the day Rex died in the line of duty, took a bullet for a fellow officer during a hostage standoff in Portland. Elias had wept that night, the only time Jake ever saw the old man cry. The memory faded as Jake stepped over a fallen beam. Ahead, Shadow stopped again this time at the base of a winding staircase. The metal railing was rusted, and shards of broken glass littered every step. Shadow let out a short bark, one sharp note, and turned toward him. Jake shined his flashlight upward. Several steps were missing, the floor above sagging under what looked like years of rot. He would have walked straight into it if Shadow hadn't warned him. He nodded, speaking softly. "Good boy." Shadow sat, tail thumping once. Jake bent down beside him. "You some old cop's partner? You guarding this place for Elias? Or are you just a stray who got too used to the ghosts?" The dog didn't answer, of course, but in the quiet, Jake felt something shift. He wasn't alone in this building, and it wasn't just about a dog or a collapsed ceiling. Something about this place, this inheritance, was wrong in ways that felt too intentional. He looked around. The walls bore signs of people coming and going. Squatters, maybe, or thrill-seekers, but none of them stayed. Dust lay too thick on most surfaces. There was something about the air watchful, unsettled. Jake turned his flashlight back on. "Let's check the west wing." Shadow stood and followed him instantly. As they turned down the hall, Jake thought about his grandfather again. Not the strict patriarch who barked orders at family dinners, but the quiet man who used to keep a photo of Rex tucked into his wallet, long after the dog was gone. Jake wondered for the first time if maybe the old man had left him the building for a reason, and maybe that reason had 4 legs and amber eyes. He walked deeper into the dark with Shadow beside him, and let the silence close around them like a secret not yet spoken. The seventh floor groaned beneath Jake's boots, its old wood bending ever so slightly as if the building exhaled under his weight. The air here was heavier, thicker, with dust and time. The kind of silence that settled in places long forgotten. His flashlight flickered again, casting erratic shadows along the hallway. Pipes hissed gently overhead, and somewhere, water dripped in a steady, tired rhythm. Shadow walked ahead, more alert than before. His fur, now visibly more silver under Jake's beam, was matted with cobwebs along the underside, but his posture was solid. His ears stood sharp both now, as if the alertness had awakened something younger within him, and his tail flicked in slow rhythm. This floor meant something to him. That much was obvious. Jake's own senses sharpened. He paused in front of a room at the far end of the hallway, its door, unlike the others, which were rotting or hanging off rusted hinges. This one stood firm. Heavy oak. Polished once, though time had dulled its sheen. But at eye level, there it was, a faint carving, nearly worn away but still visible under angled light, the shape of a police badge. Jake's breath caught. Not just a badge. His grandfather's precinct shield, stylized with the old crest of Cedar Hollow, the same one from the dusty archives Jake had browsed as a rookie. The carving hadn't been made recently. The weathering suggested decades. He reached out to touch it, but before his hand made contact, Shadow barked loud, sharp, commanding. Jake turned fast. Shadow stood stiff as stone between him and the door, eyes locked not on Jake, but on the stairwell behind them. Footsteps. Jake's hand dropped to his sidearm by instinct, but he didn't draw. Instead, he waited. Shadow gave a low, rumbling growl. From the stairwell emerged three figures young, layered in mismatched coats and hooded sweatshirts. One boy wore a denim jacket 4 sizes too big. A girl, perhaps 19, clutched a duffel bag with a busted zipper, and behind them, a third teen with a limp and a red beanie, eyes darting like a bird's. They froze at the sight of Jake. The one in the denim jacket spoke first, voice cautious. "We didn't know anyone was here." Jake took a moment to assess them. They weren't armed, at least not visibly. Their clothes were soaked. Their shoes barely held together. All three looked exhausted, as though the world had been chewing them up for years. He kept his tone level. "This building isn't safe. You shouldn't be here." The girl stepped forward, pushing back her hood. She was tall and thin, face sunken slightly from hunger. Freckles spanned the bridge of her nose. "We just needed a place to sleep. Out of the rain, that's all." Jake nodded once, slowly. "I get it." He reached into his backpack and pulled out a granola bar, then another. A bottle of water. He handed them over. The boy in the red beanie stared, suspicious. "Why are you helping us?" Jake shrugged. "Because someone once told me a building, even an abandoned one, could still save a life." The girl looked down at Shadow, who still stood planted between them and the carved door. His growl had ceased, but he hadn't moved. Jake followed her gaze. "He's not usually this on edge." The girl knelt slightly, hand reaching out in silent offering. But Shadow took a step forward and let out a deep bark, not aggressive but loud enough to send a message. Jake raised a hand. "You should go. Seriously. He doesn't want you near that door, and neither do I. I don't know what's behind it yet." The three exchanged uncertain glances. Then, wordlessly, they turned and made their way back down the stairs, the food still clutched tight. Jake waited until their footsteps faded into silence. Then he turned back to the door. Shadow had calmed but remained planted in place, watching the base of the door like a soldier. Jake knelt beside him. "You don't trust easily," he murmured. "Smart?" Shadow moved, suddenly pawing at a pile of debris beside the door, an overturned bucket, pieces of drywall, and a broken chair leg. The dust kicked up thick and yellow-gray. Jake leaned over. "What is it?" Shadow dug deeper, his claws scraping wood beneath the filth, and soon something clicked, a soft clink of metal against concrete. Jake reached in, brushed the last of the dirt aside, and uncovered a key. It was old, heavy, with a green patina dulling the brass. A leather tag, cracked and brittle, still clung to the loop. Jake turned it toward the light. The faded letters were nearly illegible, but he could still make out one thing: a number 707. Jake looked up at the carved shield on the door. Room 707. Shadow wagged his tail once, softly. A rare smile flickered across Jake's lips. Of course you knew. He turned the key slowly in his palm. He didn't insert it, not yet. The moment felt sacred somehow, as if unlocking the door might unravel something fragile, something left behind for him alone. He leaned against the wall, eyes still on the carving. You know, my grandfather once said there were two kinds of buildings, the kind people build to be seen, and the kind they build to hide things. Which do you think this was? Shadow said nothing, but sat beside him, waiting, as if he, too, had heard that quote before, and so the door remained closed for now, but in Jake's hand the key grew warm. Jake held the key tighter as he turned it in the lock of room 707. The tumblers clicked slowly, one by one, as though the door had been holding its breath for years. With a soft groan, the ancient door creaked open. Dust rolled out like fog. The air inside was dry and heavy with the scent of time-old paper, leather, and something faintly metallic. Shadow entered first. His movements were slower now, but each step was deliberate. His nose swept the ground, tail raised halfway, ears flicking an alert rhythm. The room was dim, lit only by the weak afternoon sun bleeding through high, grime-covered windows. It had once been an office. Jake could tell from the layout. A large oak desk sat in the center, layered in a thick blanket of dust. On the walls hung empty picture frames, a faded map of Cedar Hollow with pinholes clustered downtown, and above the desk a black and white photograph, still hanging askew. Jake stepped closer, brushing away cobwebs. The photo captured 7 men in uniform. Most of them looked serious, except one in the middle, a tall, broad man with high cheekbones, square jaw, and a rare half-smile tugging at his lips. Elias Harrison. Jake's grandfather stood beside a younger version of himself, no older than 30, and 3 K9 German shepherds, lean and poised, stared straight into the lens. One had a scar over its left eye. Below the photo, the caption read, Cedar Hollow PD. K9 Unit, 1981. Jake stared at it, surprised. I didn't know you were part of a unit this big, he whispered. You never talked about them. Shadow let out a soft whine. Jake turned to see him standing by a tall, tilted bookshelf. He was pawing lightly at something wedged behind the base. Hold on, Jake said, walking over. He knelt beside the dog, brushing away loose wood shavings and dust. Behind the shelf was a narrow gap, and barely visible was a glint of metal. Shadow nudged it once with his nose, then stepped back. Jake reached in and pulled out a small, rectangular tin box. It was light, scuffed, with hinges rusted at the edges. He flipped it open carefully. Inside was a sleek electronic key card out of place in such a dusty room. Tucked beneath it was a folded piece of paper, yellowed and fragile. Jake opened the note slowly. The handwriting was Elias's precise, firm cursive that hadn't changed in decades. If you're reading this, you came not for gold, but for truth. The real treasure lies beyond what greedy eyes could understand. Trust the dog. He knows the way. E.H. Jake's heart skipped. You really did plan this, he murmured. He looked back at the desk and began clearing it off. Dust flew into the air as he uncovered an old leather-bound journal. Its cover had Elias's initials burned into the corner. The leather was cracked, but still strong. He opened to the first page. They think I've gone soft. They think I'll die quietly, but I see what they don't. Corruption growing like mold under the badge, and I won't leave it to rot. Jake turned page after page. It wasn't just a journal. It was a record. There were dates, names, case numbers, notations about internal investigations, about suspicious promotions, falsified reports. The deeper Jake read, the clearer it became. Elias had spent years documenting corruption in the Cedar Hollow Police Department, but had never turned it in. Why? Jake sat back, stunned. Shadow rested beside him now, his head on his paws, eyes closed but ears twitching at every sound. Jake flipped forward. On one page, a short note was paper-clipped. The funds I pulled from Operation Caldera, they thought it vanished. It didn't. I hid it where only family and loyalty would ever reach. The greedy won't find it. They never understood patience. Or dogs. Jake let out a long breath. So, you weren't just hiding money, he said aloud. You were hiding justice. He closed the journal, heart racing. Shadow stirred, ears perked again, eyes open and staring toward the far side of the room. There was a cabinet half sunk into the floorboards. Jake walked toward it, opened its drawer, and found more documents, bank slips, building plans, encrypted account numbers. Jake gathered what he could carry into his backpack. The electronic key, he now suspected, belonged to a hidden location inside the building. Maybe even the vault Elias had alluded to. He knelt beside Shadow and gently scratched behind the old dog's ears. "You've done this before, haven't you, with him?" Shadow's eyes softened, and he leaned into the touch. Jake smiled faintly. "Then let's keep going, partner." They left room 707 with the door left ajar, the dust still swirling in slow spirals behind them. The electronic key rested cool in Jake's palm as he stood before the steel panel tucked behind the cabinet's false backing. Unlike everything else in the building, the panel was sleek, dust-free, and clearly more modern, probably installed in the last 20 years. It blinked once, waiting. Jake inhaled and pressed the key into the slot. A faint mechanical hum broke the silence. Then a click. A piece of the floor beside the cabinet shifted ever so slightly. Dust and debris crumbled into the cracks. Shadow perked up immediately, tail raised, his body tense like a drawn bowstring. Jake stepped cautiously toward the disturbed section of flooring. A faint groove, now revealed by the shifting floorboards, formed a square outline about 4 feet wide. He knelt and ran his fingers along the seam. Another click. The entire square section of floor dropped 6 inches, then slid open to reveal a descending spiral staircase of steel, narrow, rusted, and surrounded by thick concrete walls. Jake looked at Shadow, who whined softly. "Yeah," Jake muttered. "That's the part in the movie where the audience yells, 'Don't go down there.'" But he went anyway. With his flashlight in one hand and his other hand brushing the cold railing, Jake descended into the shadows. Shadow followed silently, his paws clicking on the metal stairs. The air turned damp and metallic, and the walls closed in tighter with each step. At the base of the stairwell was a steel door, marked only by a worn brass plaque that read, "Authorized Access Only." Jake scanned the key again. The door hissed slightly and opened inward. Inside was a chamber, no larger than a standard living room, but entirely made of reinforced concrete. Industrial shelves lined the walls, empty and dusty. In the center, a pedestal with a sealed glass case. Inside the case was a smaller metal box, not much larger than a shoebox. Jake took a step forward. Suddenly, without warning, the entrance behind him slammed shut. A solid clang echoed through the chamber as the steel door locked tight. Red lights flared along the upper corners of the room. A sharp hiss of pressure change made Jake's ears pop. The air was still, but somehow heavier. Shadow let out a sharp bark and turned back to the door, pawing at it, teeth bared. Jake rushed to the panel next to the door, but the interface blinked an angry red. "Access denied. System locked." A tight wave of panic surged in his chest. He banged his fist against the panel. "No, no, 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 come on!" The air grew warmer, slowly but surely. A low, mechanical humming filled the silence. Jake stepped back from the door, breathing heavily. He turned to Shadow, who now stood at a small ventilation grate near the floor. The grate was barely wide enough for a dog to crawl through, but Shadow sniffed at it, then turned to Jake with sharp eyes. Jake knelt, trying to stay calm. "Okay, think. Elias didn't set this up to kill me. There has to be a way out." His grandfather's voice returned in his memory. "If you're ever trapped, trust your partner. You won't have all the answers, but a good partner sees what you miss." Jake looked at Shadow. "You're my partner now," he murmured. The dog whined, then began digging at the ventilation grate with urgency. Jake moved to help, pulling out the multi-tool from his belt. He jammed the flathead into the screws holding the panel. They groaned in resistance, but after a few forceful turns, the grate fell loose. Shadow looked at him once, just once, then dropped to his belly and slid through the vent. Jake held his breath. Minutes ticked by like hours. Sweat beaded on his forehead. The chamber's hum grew louder. The box in the glass case now glowed faintly. Then click. A soft, grinding sound came from the wall. Then, with a thunk, the steel door began to shift. Jake staggered back as it unlocked and slowly swung open. Standing there, dusty and panting, was Shadow. In his teeth, a torn bit of rope dangled, one clearly connected to a secondary manual release hidden somewhere inside the vent tunnel. The dog wagged his tail once, then walked in and sat, as if nothing unusual had happened. Jake dropped to one knee beside him, burying his face in the dog's fur. "You just saved my life," he whispered, "just like you did for him." Shadow leaned into the contact, his eyes calm and patient. Jake turned back toward the glass case. This time, when he stepped forward, nothing moved. No alarms, no hums. He approached the pedestal, heart pounding, and peered into the box within the case. Whatever this treasure was, it had nearly cost him everything. And yet, it wasn't gold, or money, or jewels. It was something far more dangerous, truth hidden too long. The air was different now. It was as if the building itself had taken a breath and was waiting, silently, as Jake stepped deeper into the underground chamber. The scent of concrete and dust still lingered, but beneath it was something else: old metal, the faint whiff of oil, and the unmistakable sterile chill of a place untouched by time. Shadow walked ahead of him with purpose, his paws tapping softly against the concrete floor. His body was tense, but not fearful. He seemed to know exactly where they were going. At the end of a short corridor, partially hidden behind a decaying partition, stood a massive steel door, at least 8 feet high and twice as wide. It was a darker gray than the walls, framed with reinforced bolts. On its face was a brass panel, worn with time but still legible. Etched into the surface were the words, "For my true heir." Jake stared at it, mouth slightly open. Shadow sat down in front of the door and looked up at him, not wagging, not whining, just watching. Jake slowly stepped closer, pulling the electronic key from his pocket. His hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer weight of the moment. This wasn't just some door, it was a final message, a test, a declaration. He found the slot just beneath the inscription. It had been carefully hidden behind a sliding panel that clicked open as his finger brushed against it. He inserted the key. There was a long pause. Then click. The locks disengaged with a sound like thunder rolling underground. A deep, mechanical rumble shook the floor as the vault door creaked, groaned, and slowly swung open inward, revealing what lay inside. The room beyond was brightly lit, in stark contrast to the dim corridors behind. Small, motion-triggered lights flickered on one by one along the ceiling. Jake stepped inside slowly, in awe. Shelves lined the concrete walls, stacked with neatly packed bundles of cash $100 bills tied with old banking bands, each labeled with dates from nearly 20 years ago. In the center of the room sat 3 large crates, solid oak with iron fittings. Their lids were already open. Jake approached the nearest one and peered inside. Gold. Not just coins, but ingots polished, engraved with federal marks, and stacked like a forgotten treasure from a storybook. He stepped back in disbelief and turned in a slow circle. There were ledgers, too, handwritten, categorized, meticulous, all bearing Elias's looping script. Jake felt his knees weaken. He leaned against the crate and slowly sat down on the cold floor. $100 million, at least. It was overwhelming. Not just the wealth, but the meaning behind it. He thought of his uncles and aunts, their sneering faces at the reading of the will, mocking him for inheriting an old ruin. The way they had all circled like vultures, fighting over bank accounts, land deeds, stocks. And here, hidden beneath the bones of a forgotten building, was the true inheritance. Jake remembered Elias's journal. The greedy won't find it. They never understood patience, or dogs. The room was silent, except for the steady breath of Shadow, who had walked to Jake's side and sat beside him, tall and poised. The dog didn't move or sniff at the gold or sniff around like a curious animal. He simply sat, watchful, loyal, a sentinel. Jake looked at him closely for the first time in this new light. Shadow was clearly a senior dog, his muzzle grayed but his eyes were sharp. His body, though aged, still carried the strength and elegance of a trained working dog. His fur was a mixture of deep sable and black, with light patches around his chest and paws. There were scars, too, one along his rib, another faint one across his shoulder. This dog had seen things, lived through more than one life. Perhaps he had been Elias's partner in his final years. Jake rested a hand gently on Shadow's back. "He trusted you," he said quietly. "With everything." He looked back at the vault. Jake wasn't foolish. He understood the responsibility this wealth brought. It was more than just money, it was a legacy, forged not from greed but from pain, secrecy, and foresight. Elias had hoarded it not to die rich, but to pass on something untouched by corruption. Jake stood slowly, brushing the dust from his jeans. There were no instructions, no final will beyond the vault itself. But Jake knew this wasn't just about him, it was about what he would do next. The money could rebuild Cedar Hollow's neglected streets, rescue the town's struggling families, fund programs for K-9 units like the ones Elias had once led. It could do good if guarded wisely. And maybe that's why Elias chose him. Not because Jake was perfect, but because he still listened, because he still cared. As he turned to leave, Shadow rose too, falling in step without command. Jake glanced back one more time at the gold-filled vault, then reached for the door control. He didn't close it fully, just enough to keep it hidden. Some truths should be kept sacred until the right time. As they climbed the stairs back into the quiet hush of the building, the weight on Jake's shoulders was no longer just about inheritance. It was a burden, yes, but also a purpose. And Shadow, the old dog with a soldier's heart, would be there every step of the way. The wind that evening had a different bite to it. It howled through the alleyways of Cedar Hollow like it carried warnings from generations past, wrapping around the tall, weather-worn tenement building as if trying to shield it from what was coming. Jake stood on the roof, looking out over the town, his hands tucked deep in his coat pockets. Below, Shadow patrolled the perimeter with silent vigilance. Ever since the vault had been opened, Jake had felt something shifting like the walls themselves, whispered of old truths and new dangers. Though he hadn't told a soul, secrets had a way of leaking through cracks no matter how tightly they were sealed. And tonight, the silence felt too loud. It began with headlights. 2 trucks pulled up in front of the building, their engines rumbling like hungry beasts. Jake descended the stairwell, heart steady, already knowing who had come. As he stepped outside into the cold, damp air, 4 figures emerged from the vehicles. The first was Richard Harrison, his father's older brother. Tall, broad-shouldered, and slick in a gray overcoat, Richard looked like a man who had never missed a chance to cash in. His salt and pepper hair was slicked back, and his sharp jaw was locked in what could only be described as a greedy sneer. Beside him was his son, Marcus, in his early 30s, with a stocky build and an arrogance that rolled off him like cologne. 2 more relatives flanked them, cousins Jake barely knew but recognized from the will reading. All wore the same expression: entitlement. "Well, well," Richard said, his voice oozing condescension. "Looks like the rumors were true after all. Grandpa wasn't as senile as we thought." Jake didn't move. "This building, and what's inside is under legal protection. You all have no claim here." "Oh, don't give me that," Marcus spat. "You think we believe Elias gave you everything, out of the kindness of his heart?" Jake narrowed his eyes. "He gave it to the one person who didn't try to drain him dry." Richard took a threatening step forward. "That gold belongs to the family, not just you." Behind them, Shadow emerged from the shadows, silent as a phantom. His coat glistened under the street lamp's soft glow, his body lowered into a protective stance. A low growl hummed from his throat. Marcus laughed nervously. "What, the mutt's your bodyguard now?" Jake's voice remained level. "Careful, he's not just a dog." The tension thickened. Then suddenly, Marcus lunged forward. The move was clumsy born from anger, not strategy, but it was enough to trigger instinct. Shadow launched. The German Shepherd moved with precision and power. In a flash, he intercepted Marcus mid-charge, forcing the man to stumble back as the dog bared his teeth and snarled with the fury of a trained protector. The other cousins flinched, startled. Richard stepped back, hands raised. "Call off the damn animal," Jake called out. "Shadow, stay." The dog paused, still growling, his body blocking Jake. At that moment, red and blue lights lit the street. Sheriff Nina Alvarez's cruiser pulled up behind the trucks, followed by 2 more local officers. Sheriff Alvarez was a tall woman in her late 40s, with sharp hazel eyes and a calm but commanding presence. Her dark brown hair was pulled back into a low ponytail beneath her campaign hat, and her hand rested lightly on the holster at her side. She stepped out of the car and surveyed the scene. "Evening, gentlemen. Seems we've got a little family dispute going on." Richard straightened his coat. "Sheriff, this is a private matter." Nina raised an eyebrow. "Private? You're trespassing on property legally inherited by Officer Harrison, and I'm hearing reports of an altercation." Jake exhaled quietly, thankful. Nina had always been a steady presence in town, someone Elias trusted and who had known Jake since his academy days. She turned to Jake. "Everything all right?" Jake nodded. "They came looking for something that doesn't belong to them." Richard stepped forward. "We demand legal review." "You can demand it all you want," Nina cut him off, "but you do it through the court, not by intimidation. Now get back in your trucks before I file charges for assault and trespassing." Grumbling, Richard motioned to his group. Marcus cast one last hateful glance at Jake, his pride wounded more than his body, then got into the truck. As the vehicles drove off, Nina approached Jake. Word travels fast when money's involved. Jake glanced down at Shadow, who had relaxed but still watched the retreating taillights. "I didn't tell anyone." "You didn't have to," Nina said. "Your uncle's got contacts all over. Someone probably saw you moving around in the building. Word spread." Jake nodded slowly, the weight of responsibility growing heavier by the minute. Nina placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You're not alone in this. If you need help securing the building, say the word. But be careful. You've stepped into something bigger than old walls and old money." As she left, Jake crouched beside Shadow and scratched gently behind his ears. "You saved me again," he whispered. The dog leaned into his touch, eyes soft now, the warrior in him momentarily at rest. Jake looked back at the building. For the first time since discovering the vault, he realized this wasn't just about preserving what Elias had hidden. It was about protecting it from those who would twist its purpose. And with Shadow beside him, he was ready. The morning after the confrontation brought a quiet unlike any Jake had known since inheriting the building. The early light filtered through the grimy windows of the 7th floor, spilling across the floorboards like a golden sigh. Outside, the streets of Cedar Hollow moved at their usual pace, unaware of the fortune hidden just beneath their feet. But inside, Jake sat cross-legged on the dusty wooden floor of Elias's old office, the leather-bound journal open in his lap, his brows furrowed in silence. Shadow lay beside him, his head resting on his paws but eyes half open, watching his companion. The dog's ears twitched at the soft creak of the old wood, ever alert. Jake had come to rely on the shepherd more than he realized, not just for safety, but for grounding. Where money had brought confusion, Shadow had brought clarity. Jake's fingers ran over the old ink on the journal's final pages. Elias's handwriting had changed here. It was less rigid, more human, filled with the weight of reflection rather than duty. "We fight for years to build, not knowing if the ones who come after will protect or destroy. But one truth remains. Money means nothing if it doesn't save something, save someone. The world doesn't need more heirs. It needs guardians. If you find this, know that I trusted you, Jake, not because of blood, but because of heart. You still believe in what I forgot, that kindness is power. Jake closed the journal slowly. The weight of the vault pressed against his chest, heavier than its $100 million in cash and gold bars. All night he had lain awake wondering what to do with the fortune no one else knew how to use without greed poisoning it. He could keep it, build a life, disappear from Cedar Hollow and let others rot in their bitterness. But that wasn't what Elias wanted. A soft whine pulled Jake from his thoughts. Shadow had stood, his body angled toward the broken window, tail flicking slowly. He gave a low huff, then walked to the ledge and placed his front paws gently on the windowsill. Curious, Jake rose and joined him. From this height he could see the narrow alleyway behind the building. The street below was still cracked, old graffiti fading under layers of time. And walking along the edge of the block, bundled in ragged coats and carrying plastic bags stuffed with clothing, were 3 figures. Jake squinted. It was the group of young homeless people he'd turned away days ago. One of them, a thin boy with shaggy red hair, maybe 17, stumbled slightly as he walked, limping. Another, a girl with cropped hair and a large army jacket, held his arm to steady him. They were still out here, still wandering, still cold. Shadow turned and looked at Jake, just one look, and Jake understood. This wasn't just about charity, this was about purpose. The building was crumbling, but it still stood. The fortune was hidden, but it could be used, not for luxury, but for healing. Jake sat back on the floor, his mind racing. Could he trust himself not to let pride and legacy get in the way of compassion? Could he make something bigger than a legacy? He thought of his childhood Elias not as a cold, former sheriff, but as the man who brought injured animals home, who gave stray dogs names, who once helped a widowed neighbor rebuild a broken porch without ever asking for thanks. He thought of that moment again, the boy limping, the girl steadying him, and Shadow staring through the glass. Jake stood up, decision made, but first he had to understand the limits of the will. That afternoon, he returned to the law office where the will had first been read. This time, he requested a private meeting with Margaret Sloan, the second partner of the firm and Elias's longtime legal confidant. Margaret was a sharp-eyed woman in her early 60s, always dressed in gray suits and pearl earrings. Her demeanor was firm but fair, someone who didn't waste words or time. As Jake sat across from her desk, she reviewed the final amendment to Elias's estate file. "You want to turn the building into what exactly?" she asked, adjusting her reading glasses. "A transitional housing center," Jake replied. "Emergency beds, meals, community programs, a place to train dogs like Shadow for veterans or therapy purposes. I wanted to honor him, properly." Margaret studied him for a long moment, then smiled faintly. "He said you might say something like this." Jake blinked. "He did?" Margaret nodded. "Jake, there was an envelope sealed separately from the will. He told me to give it to you only if you came back, if you chose not to sell the building or keep the money." She opened a drawer and slid a small envelope across the table. The paper was old and yellowing, but Jake recognized his grandfather's handwriting immediately. Inside was a short note. "If you found the vault and still chose people over profit, then I didn't fail. Do with it what I couldn't. Build something worth more than gold." Jake swallowed hard. When he left the office, the sun was beginning to dip behind the trees. The streets glowed amber, and the first hint of winter chill settled into the breeze. Back at the building, Jake stood again in the vault chamber. This time, he wasn't overwhelmed. He was resolved. Shadow sat beside him, tail gently sweeping the floor. "Guess we've got work to do, boy," Jake whispered. The dog leaned his head against Jake's side, eyes half closed in silent agreement. The first hammer fell on a cold Tuesday morning. Mist clung to the streets of Cedar Hollow like a reluctant memory, swirling around the base of the once-abandoned 10-story building that loomed quietly above the town. But something had changed. There was life in the scaffolding, movement in the shadows, and hope behind every window. Jake Harrison stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, gloves tugged tight, and warmth in his chest that hadn't been there in years. His flannel jacket bore dust from morning work, and his once polished boots were now scuffed with honest effort. Around him, a small team of workers hauled wood, sanded beams, and painted over the grime of decades. But they weren't just workers. Among them was Tyrell, the lanky 17-year-old redhead from the alley, now filling out with strength and gratitude. His limp was still present, but his pride stood taller than ever. Tyrell had proven himself useful with wiring and light fixtures, quick to learn and eager to contribute. Nearby, Sierra, the cropped-haired girl with the army jacket painted murals on the inside stairwells, turning cracked walls into stories of resilience. Jake had offered them shelter, but they'd asked for something more: purpose. And now they helped rebuild the place that had once turned them away. Shadow lay at the base of the building's new wooden sign: Elias Haven, a home for the forgotten. The German shepherd's ears perked at the sounds around him, tail sweeping in slow, content rhythm. At nearly 10 years old, his muzzle was dusted with gray, but his posture was proud, as if he understood the sacredness of his new title guardian, not of vaults or secrets, but of second chances. "Doors going in today," Tyrell called to Jake, his voice rough but excited. "Good. Let's get that front cleaned up before the press gets curious," Jake replied, smiling. It had taken months. Paperwork. Legal loops. But with Margaret Sloane's help, who surprisingly had a soft spot for children and community projects, Jake had managed to restructure a trust. He kept enough to maintain the property and support himself modestly. The rest had been designated for the foundation, with long-term protections against exploitation. Inside the building, what was once a cold vault was now a food pantry and emergency supplies hub. Old offices had been converted into warm sleeping quarters. The 7th floor was turned into therapy rooms and small classrooms for GED training, job prep, and counseling. In the center lobby, where Elias's desk had once collected dust, stood a small bronze statue, a man in uniform beside a German shepherd. No plaque named Jake, only Elias. And behind the statue, above the fireplace, painted on the wall in bold, solemn strokes, "Kindness is power." Jake ran a hand through his dark hair as he oversaw the placement of couches and bookshelves in what used to be the ground-floor lobby. It was strange to see it come alive again. He paused when he saw Mrs. Norwood step through the entrance. Helen Norwood was in her late 60s, a retired librarian who had lived in Cedar Hollow her entire life. She was short and round, with thick glasses and a perpetual air of pleasant disapproval. When Jake had first mentioned converting the building, she had frowned. But now, as she looked around the interior, her mouth fell slightly open. "I remember when this place was condemned," she whispered. "Now it looks like something out of a church." Jake smiled. "Just trying to build something worth remembering." "Well, Officer Harrison," she said, patting his arm, "you've done more than build. You've resurrected." By afternoon, the soft golden light of fall stretched across the rooftop garden. Another new addition made possible by the untouched structure of the 10th floor. Jake sat on a wooden bench there, shadow at his feet, watching the street below. He was quiet. "Do you think he'd be proud?" Jake asked aloud. Shadow didn't answer, but he leaned against Jake's leg, eyes calm, breath steady. The comfort of that gesture was answer enough. That evening, as the town gathered for the official ribbon-cutting ceremony, people poured into the streets. Children held balloons shaped like dogs, veterans stood at attention, and mothers wiped their eyes. The mayor of Cedar Hollow, a man named Clark Banning, tall with silvery hair and an impressive mustache, took the mic and cleared his throat. "Jake Harrison isn't just a cop, he's a builder of hope. What you see behind me was once a ruin, but now, thanks to him and one remarkable dog, it's something else entirely. A symbol. A promise." Applause echoed off the brick and glass. When the ribbon was cut, Shadow trotted beside Jake, stepping into the building like a noble guardian returning to his post. Children flocked to pet him, and even the sternest of visitors smiled. From that day forward, Shadow became the face of Elias Haven, his photograph on brochures, his name on the community events board. They called him the Shepherd of Hope. The morning sun broke gently over Cedar Hollow, washing the streets in a golden warmth that felt more like spring than autumn. The once abandoned building now stood proud and renewed, a 10-story tribute to hope, redemption, and quiet heroism. Outside Elias Haven, rows of chairs had been set on the front lawn where the grass was just beginning to grow again. A stage had been constructed, simple but sturdy, made of reclaimed wood from the old flooring of the 7th floor. There was no velvet, no fanfare, just sincerity. That was the way Jake wanted it. Jake Harrison stood behind the podium, wearing a simple gray suit that fit him better than he expected. His once disheveled hair had been neatly trimmed, and the faint scar above his brow earned during one of his early police operations seemed almost symbolic now. His hands were steady as he adjusted the mic. Behind him sat several of the people who had been part of the journey. Mayor Clark Banning, with his signature silver mustache and polished shoes, Helen Norwood, the town's retired librarian, wearing a pale blue dress and clutching a program, and Tyrell and Sierra, now proudly sporting name tags that read, Staff, Elias Haven. And beside Jake, lying calmly at his feet, was Shadow. The German Shepherd's coat had grown glossier in recent months thanks to regular meals and care. Though his eyes still held the weariness of age, they also gleamed with pride. A small ribbon tied loosely around his neck marked the day red, white, and navy blue. Jake cleared his throat, then began. This building was once forgotten. Like many things in life, it stood with a history that no one cared to remember. It was broken, worn, dismissed, and if I'm honest, I once felt the same about myself. A hush fell over the crowd. The townspeople leaned in, not out of politeness, but from true attention. Jake continued. When my grandfather left me this place, most of the family laughed. They saw nothing but dust and cracked concrete. But he left something else too, a path, a lesson, and a silent partner in that journey. He looked down. Shadow raised his head, ears tilting slightly. This dog, Jake said, voice softening, was waiting for me before I knew what I needed. He didn't speak, but he showed me where to step, warned me of danger, and reminded me again and again that loyalty doesn't need words. His name is Shadow, and he's more than a companion, he's the soul of this place. Applause rippled through the audience. Some wiped tears. Tyrell whistled softly. Jake paused, letting the silence speak before he went on. My grandfather, Elias Harrison, was not a man of lavish wealth. He was a man of principles. He once wrote in his journal, True value lies not in gold or bricks, but in the shelter we build for others. That's what Elias Haven is. Not a shelter of walls, but of hearts. The speech concluded with a slow standing ovation. People didn't cheer loudly, they stood slowly, as if the message required reverence. Jake stepped back and sat beside Shadow, who nudged his leg gently with a quiet huff, almost as if to say, You did well, kid. As the crowd mingled, old family members, distant cousins, and sharp-suited uncles who had once scoffed approached Jake. Their words were polite now, deferential even. No one asked for a share of the money anymore. The vault had long been emptied, not in currency, but in compassion. Jake had made sure of that. Among the faces was Aunt Ruth, a woman in her early 60s with sharp cheekbones and tightly coiled silver hair. She had once called Jake a foolish sentimentalist at the will reading. Now she looked at the center with reluctant awe. You turned it into something real, she said. Jake smiled. That was always the point. Ruth nodded, not quite able to say more, and walked away quietly. Later that day, Jake returned inside with Shadow. The hallways were quiet again, the event complete. He wandered into the 7th floor office, Elias's old room, now restored and filled with photographs of the town's transformation. On the wall was the black and white portrait of Elias and his canine partner, Bruno. Jake had added another frame beside it, him and Shadow, captured candidly one morning on the rooftop garden, laughing as Shadow tried to lick paint off his sleeve. He sat at the old desk, flipping through the final pages of Elias's journal. One note, dated nearly 20 years ago, caught his eye. The true heir may come not for riches, but for purpose. If he comes with kindness in his heart, he'll know what to do. Jake leaned back in the chair. "I hope I did it right, Grandpa." Shadow barked, once soft, almost ceremonial. That night, under a blanket of stars, Jake and Shadow walked to the rooftop. From there, Cedar Hollow shimmered faintly below, sleepy and safe. Jake sat with his back against a planter of herbs, Shadow beside him, both bathed in moonlight. There was no need for more words. They had built something not just for now, but for after, something that would outlive them, a legacy made not of wealth, but of love and quiet heroism. Sometimes, the things the world throws away, the broken buildings, the abandoned dogs, the quiet souls, are exactly where God's miracles begin. Jake didn't find treasure in gold. He found it in purpose. He found it in a dog who never left his side, and he found it in the quiet voice of his grandfather's legacy, whispering through time, "Use what you've been given to heal the world." Perhaps this story reached you today for a reason. Maybe there's a shadow waiting at your door. Maybe there's a forgotten part of your life that still holds purpose. Maybe, just maybe, God isn't finished writing your chapter yet. So, if this story touched your heart, please don't scroll away. Leave a comment below and type "Amen" if you believe that every abandoned soul, human or animal, deserves a second chance. Share this story with someone who might need a reminder that they are not forgotten. Subscribe to our channel for more true stories of faith, courage, and second chances. And may God bless you and everyone you love, today and always.